One common argument against individual liberty and in favor of government control over our choices is the idea that individual freedom is bad for the environment. We all agree that freedom doesn't give you the right to hurt other people, but unless our economy is regulated by the government, what's to stop people from polluting the air and water and causing permanent and maybe catastrophic damage to the planet?
Some people think that the solution to this problem is to have the government tell us what kinds of fuels we can use, what kinds of cars we can drive, what kinds of stoves we can use, even what we can eat. The biggest problem with that is that the biggest polluter in the world is government.
In fact, the dirtiest places on the planet are not the free societies. On the contrary, the most polluted environments on Earth are places where the government has the most control over individual lives. China, for example, or the former Soviet Union. If that seems paradoxical, the answer is actually pretty simple. It lies in a principle that the environmentalist Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. That name comes from the way shepherds used to graze their flocks centuries ago in England. In those days, towns often had a plot of grass called a commons, which was not owned by any particular individual, but by the town as a whole. What that really meant was that it had no owner. And that meant no particular person was responsible for that land. So if a shepherd took his sheep out on the commons, there was no reason why he shouldn't let the sheep eat all of the grass. In fact, there's no particular reason for him not to throw his trash around or otherwise take poor care of the land because it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the town as a whole. In other words, he gets the benefit of the grass by grazing his sheep, but he doesn't have to take responsibility for it. And that's true for all the other shepherds too. As a result, the commons tended to be overexploited. No particular person suffered when the commons were damaged, so nobody wanted to spend time protecting them. Hardin wasn't the first to notice this problem. Thousands of years ago, the philosopher Aristotle said, "That which is owned by nobody has the least amount of care bestowed upon it." And you've probably witnessed this in your own life. Public property is usually not as well maintained as private property. A public park isn't as nice as the privately owned country club. The playground at the public school isn't as nice as the playground at the private school. The waiting room at the Department of Motor Vehicles isn't as nice as the waiting room at your doctor's office. Economists explain this in terms of what they call externalities. That's a technical term for when you inflict some kind of cost on another person. If you can do something that imposes a cost on another person which you don't have to pay, then there's no reason for you not to do so because you get the benefit without having to pay for it. On the other hand, if you do have to pay that person for the cost you've imposed on him, then economists call that internalizing an externality. Private property automatically internalizes externalities, which just means that if I pollute my own land, I suffer the costs of that. Whereas if I pollute public land, or land that's not owned by any particular person, I probably won't suffer the same kind of burden. True, the government can punish someone who pollutes publicly owned land, but they have to catch the guy first. And it's expensive to pay the police to monitor public parks. Privately owned land, on the other hand, like the country club, has an economic incentive to hire a guard to keep out polluters. It's that word incentive that's important. Private ownership creates an incentive to take responsibility for property, because if I damage my own property, I'm the one who suffers, and that cost gets internalized. And if I harm someone else's property, I can be held to account. I can be sued for damages. But public property doesn't create the same kind of incentive to take responsibility for something. If I damage so-called public property, then I probably won't suffer. I can probably get away with it, or force taxpayers to make up the cost.
In a communist society where the government owns everything, I have no incentive not to pollute. After all, nobody owns the land, so there's nobody around really to complain about it. And of course, the government is already in charge of everything. And if the government owns all of the land, it also has no incentive not to pollute. After all, you can't exactly sue it.
What's more, in a country without private property, all decisions about what to do with land are made by politicians, not by individual citizens or property owners. So if it's politically expedient to do so, why not just throw toxic waste in some open field? In their book Ecocide in the USSR, Alfred Friendly and Murray Feshbach write, "The Soviet economic and political system ensured a low level of priority for environmental protection. Because natural resources as state property were effectively cost-free to industry, there was no way to calculate the social costs involved in degrading or wasting irreplaceable assets." In other words, if Soviet farmers or engineers wanted to use some natural resource, or if they all wanted to get rid of toxic waste, all they needed was permission from the government's bureaucracy, that's all. They didn't have to factor in the costs that their actions would impose on other people. They didn't have to internalize their externalities. By contrast, in a society with strong property rights, any company that wants to engage in mining or timber cutting or power generation has to take those costs into account. They could be sued if they damage someone else's property, and customers could get upset about the pollution and boycott the business. A system of private property rights, in other words, internalizes the externalities. It makes those who cause pollution shoulder the costs. And that explains why the most successful environmental protection groups are those that use private property rights to protect the environment. Groups like the World Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy use what they call private lands conservation. That's just a fancy term for buying up land in order to protect it against pollution. These organizations have an admirable record of protecting habitats against harm precisely because they use the incentives that property rights establish. The issue of incentives also suggests another reason why free markets tend to be better for the environment than a government-controlled economy. Production requires energy. To make anything, whether it be a car or a hamburger or an airplane or a shirt, making stuff requires energy. To power machines, to keep the lights running, to provide refrigeration and transportation and everything else. Energy, of course, costs money. But it doesn't cost money just because somebody says so. It costs money because energy takes resources. It requires coal or nuclear power or water power, some kind of input. And the cost of that input aren't just arbitrarily decided upon. They're relative to all the other things we could do with that energy. What a free economy does is it allows people to compare the costs and benefits of the alternative uses of energy to decide which ones they consider most efficient. And that means it lets people decide how much pollution they're willing to accept. To put that more simply, suppose I need a new car. I could buy a big truck that carries a lot of stuff, but it's more expensive. Or I could buy a smaller one, which doesn't carry as much, but is cheaper. Why is one more expensive than the other? Because it takes more resources to make. The big truck takes more steel and aluminum to manufacture, and that means it takes more resources from the environment to produce than the smaller truck does, and it takes more fuel to operate. All of that means that it costs more. The higher price correlates to its consequences for the environment. When I decide which truck to buy, I'm also deciding how much of an effect on the environment I'm willing to make. And the fact that I have to pay more gives me an incentive to impose less of a cost on the environment. Now, I can still choose the truck that costs more resources, but only if I expect the benefit to outweigh the costs. If I'm a deliveryman, for example, I can expect to make more money using the big truck than the small truck because I can deliver more things more efficiently that way. That's because my customers prefer to use the world's resources that way. How do I know? Because that's the economic decision they've made by hiring me. What that all boils down to is this. We don't actually want a perfectly clean environment. What we want is a clean enough environment. We want as clean an environment as we can get relative to the other things we also want. If we wanted an environment with no pollution at all, we'd have to eliminate all of our technology and go back to living in caves. But no humane person wants that. Instead, what we want is transportation and medicine and safe houses and heat in the wintertime with as little impact on the environment as possible.
That means it's a trade-off between the costs and benefits of using Earth's resources. And the question that we have to answer is, who's best suited to make the choice about those trade-offs? The government made up of politicians, or individuals like you and me making the choice for themselves?
If politicians make that call, then that decision will be made based on political factors, not the costs and benefits of pollution compared to the things we need. What free markets and private property do for us is this. They create a mechanism where those decisions can be made rationally, as opposed to being made based on political favoritism. It's no coincidence that favoritism is so rampant when it comes to the environment. Day after day, the news contains scandals about government subsidies to companies like Solyndra, who get taxpayer money for solar energy or electric cars or other things that there's no actual market demand for, and then go bankrupt and take our money down the drain. That's no surprise. After all, if there were a market demand for these products, then the government wouldn't have to subsidize them. And the fact that they're subsidized means that they don't really have to satisfy customers. They only have to satisfy politicians to get the money flowing. It's bad enough when we speak of American taxpayers being ripped off, but remember that environmental restrictions on business also impose severe costs on the developing world. In Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, people who are far, far poorer than you and I are just concerned with making enough money to put food on the table. They're eager for a factory job where they can get steady pay for producing the goods that you and I take for granted, and they need energy to do that. Of course, the industries that these countries engage in can often be quite dirty, but people there have a more urgent priority at the moment: earning a living. When the international community blocks economic growth in these countries, that's not helping. We in the United States had our Industrial Revolution more than a century ago, and at that time we committed a lot of pollution. Is it really fair for us to tell the poorer countries today that they can't have their Industrial Revolution, that they must stay poor because we wealthier people are worried about rocks and trees and rivers?
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about the environment. Obviously we should. But it's not as simple as just passing a law against fossil fuels. In fact, it's pretty clear that just banning fossil fuels would be a horrible decision that would lead to both environmental and human catastrophe.
And reasonable environmentalists recognize that. They agree that what we need isn't just a bunch of government-mandated one-size-fits-all prohibitions. What we need are rules that take economic incentives into account and let people decide for themselves how much pollution they're willing to put up with in exchange for the things that they need. Not a political solution, but a free market that lets us set our own priorities. Of course, there are some environmentalists who actually do demand the end of industrial civilization. This idea is not based on a real concern for an environment that's clean enough for human beings to flourish, but on a romantic and even mystical philosophy, one that views humanity as fundamentally tainted. This version of environmentalism traces back to the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that human beings live unhappy lives because they are not in harmony with nature. Civilization, Rousseau argued, alienates us from nature, cuts us off from our primitive, happy state as wild creatures. This is nonsense. Civilization doesn't alienate us from nature. It protects us from nature, which is always ready to destroy us in a million ways. Technology and innovation, reason and science are the only means we have to survive in a hostile universe. But to this version of environmentalist, that's just what's wrong with technology. As the philosopher Ayn Rand wrote, in their cosmology, man is infinitely malleable, controllable, and dispensable, but nature is sacrosanct. It is only man, his work, his achievement, his mind, that can be violated with impunity, while nature is not to be defiled with a single bridge or skyscraper. What do they want to conserve? Anything except man. A wise approach to the environment would reject that attitude entirely. Nature is only of value because human beings value it. To save the earth from humanity would be a contradiction in terms. The only environmentalism worth pursuing is one that respects and protects the environment for the sake of human beings, and that's possible only in a society of free markets and private property rights.